Hello and welcome back. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we are going to be talking about the best laws for human rights. We've done the other two categories already, and human rights is the most straightforward, so we're probably going to get through this pretty quick, doing it in one take. We will be first discussing which ones are all the best, just very, very quickly. Then we will go in depth into each category, and then finally we will do a little bit of a brief summary, but it shouldn't take very long. So getting right into it, the best law for free speech is going to be rights of assembly. The best law for labor rights is going to be regulatory bodies. The best ones for children's rights is going to be compulsory primary school. The best one for rights of women is going to be women's suffrage. The best one for welfare is going to be old age pension. The best one for migration is going to be no migration controls / migration controls. It's kind of the same thing, but we'll talk about it. And then finally, the best one for slavery is going to be slavery banned. Now, getting into each one of these individually, for human rights or for free speech, the very important reason you want to go rights of assembly is it unlocks what I think is the best internal security law, which is guaranteed liberties. You can only do guaranteed liberties if you're on rights of assembly or protected speech, after which you can swap it back. Now, generally speaking, swapping back will make some of your IGs upset with you, this type of thing, but it's just a matter of, okay, do we prefer having this authority and extra suppression and bolstered impact, or do we want the technology spread? The thing about technology spread is it is effectively gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because without going into it too much, the benefits of technology increase exponentially, while the costs increase linearly, which means as you get bigger and bigger, you start caring less and less about, modifiers such as these, where it's going to be giving you additional or a malus to the technology spread. So, for the most part, in the early game, when technology spread is going to be, maybe kind of stronger, maybe protected speech is better, but for the most part, I think a good play pattern is getting onto rights of assembly, passing guaranteed libs, and then just kind of staying on rights of assembly. But if you ever want to make an interest group that is a fan of censorship happy, or this type of thing, moving back up to censorship is actually quite strong once you have, once you have guaranteed liberties. And this technology spread, not too big a deal. If you're doing a lot of bolstering and suppressing, though, outlawed dissent becomes really strong. So if you're trying to juggle exact IG, keeping everyone at 20% in order to get double bonuses, this can be strong. And finally, if you go to protected speech, and this is the reason I don't like protected speech, you lose your ability to bolster, suppress, and I believe you also can't exile dissidents. And so these combined makes it so that protected speech really doesn't look particularly good, making rights of assembly, I think, the best law. Now, moving on to labor rights, this is one I am not so certain on, and so if someone wants to leave feedback in the comments, but regulatory bodies, generally dangerous working conditions minus dangerous working conditions, once you run out of peasants, this starts to become something that's pretty good. So if you have no peasants, we got a lot of peasants because we conquered Qing provinces, but if you have no peasants, this is really good for maintaining a healthy population and a healthy population growth over the course of time, this minus dangerous working conditions. What you could instead get is workers' protections. Also, this is going to be better once you get the later PMs for increasing your government administration, once you get some of the later PMs for increasing bureaucracy. But workers' protections introduces this minimum wage thing. And in earlier iterations of the game, this was a spectacular way to death spiral your country if you put in max workers' protections. However, in patch 1.5, they have introduced some mechanics that make wages don't spiral upward as easily because places will not compete if they know that they can't, make a more profitable sort of margin than the other ones, and so wages tend to stay depressed. And so workers' protections might be okay now. I haven't experimented with it too much. Every time I've experimented with level 5 workers' protections, what it tends to do is it tends to cause unemployment, and places that would be profitable if they could hire for lower wages, since they cannot hire for these lower wages, they don't hire at all, and they just kind of stay break even at a later thing. But in terms of this should increase, in theory, the power of, the trade unions and this type of stuff, but to be true, to be fair, when you start running out of peasants and this type of stuff, these guys tend to get powerful anyways. And so, we have regulatory bodies in here helping to maintain a high population without having any sort of death spirals. But if anyone has a strongly divergent opinion on this, feel free to put it in the comments. And this might be something I experiment with in the near future to try and get a better handle on this, or to confirm that I still think it's bad. if it's at lower levels, I think it's good, or better, but then we're not getting the max dangerous working conditions, which I think is the more important thing. Really wish this was split between two laws, minimum wage and workers' protection. But okay. Moving on to children's rights. Compulsory primary school is better with a bit of an asterisk. What you're giving up is you're giving up dependence income, which is a free money modifier, and increased mortality on these guys. The mortality is bad. I actually don't know if you could have this independent of the max education institution investment, which is the reason you go this. I'm not entirely sure actually if I think that the dependence income is worth this extra mortality. My suspicion is that it is worth the dependence mortality with a really low degree of confidence, but the extra institution is just so valuable because increasing literacy is really valuable. A little bit of a caveat to this is there is the Ericsson company that is present in Svealand, which is just an absolute aberration of a company, which gives you the equivalent of, it's an electronics company, this isn't the company, but it gives you the equivalent of 10 levels of private schools institution. It gives you plus 5% wealth education access. You can see here we would get 2.5 from our level 5 education investment. It gives you 5% for its prosperity bonus, which is incredibly strong, in which case you will get max literacy anyways. And so maybe there's a strategy where you go child labor allowed and get the Ericsson company, something like that. For rights of women, we have kind of a linear sort of progression. One thing that's very important to note is you cannot go women's suffrage unless you have a voting law of some kind enabled. So you have to have some sort of elections. And so if you're planning on going something, that does not have voting, like, for example, technocracy or oligarchy or autocracy, you do have to put in women's rights before you make this swap. Once you already have women's rights, you can make the swap and you can maintain it. Or women's suffrage, rather. What this is going to have in terms of difference is it's going to give you increased workforce ratio, which is a very strong modifier, and dependent enfranchisement, which isn't what we're kind of writing home about, but you're giving this up in exchange for birth rate. Generally speaking, if you are running out of pops, you are going to be better off towards the lower end of the spectrum here, getting workforce ratio. It increases at a somewhat linear rate. You can see we're exchanging birth rate. Now it's workforce ratio, now it's workforce ratio with negative birth rate, and now it's a workforce ratio with increasing negative birth rate. Important to note is this one is just kind of a free upgrade from this one, and legal guardianship, the bump to property women is a little bit better, but overall it's relatively linear, and you're going to prefer the workforce ratio when you run out of labor. If you're playing as someone with like Qing, who is not running out of labor, and you just want to grow your pops for the eventual point in time in which you run out of labor, legal guardianship will be better. And finally, it is going to be easier for you to get some agitators that are going to be important, and it's going to be easier to swap onto women's suffrage if you're already on legal guardianship, because if you get propertied women or women in the workplace, some IGs will not like the swap from this to women's suffrage. And so because of that reason, as a matter of like practice, I think it's best to stay on legal guardianship and then make the swap to women's suffrage directly, generally speaking, unless you can afford to be passing a ton of laws. But this is kind of the pattern, and the workforce ratio is going to be a very, very strong modifier, allowing you to utilize more workers. And this, another reason why this is strong is because you'll be generating a lot of workers generally through migration, more so than the actual pop growth. But even without it, this will allow, your workers to overall be more wealthy per capita because more workers per capita are working. Next up, we have welfare, which we discussed wanting to have old age pension. Now, on some countries, specifically Great Qing starts on poor laws. You actually want to swap back to no social security because it's a huge bureaucracy sink. However, I think old age pension is best. A lot of times kind of just get stuck in on poor laws, not because the swap is impossible, but because I think the approval of the industrialists, in order to get the job creators bonus is pretty strong. And generally, I think giving this up in exchange for, better welfare is maybe not so worth it. For the most part, I think the welfare shouldn't be too big an important factor overall, because the people it pays out to are the people who are unemployed. Generally speaking, a very, very strong practice, and we have a ton of unemployed here, but I'd like to reiterate, it's because we've taken a bunch of Qing provinces. But generally speaking, I think if you have a bunch of unemployed people, what you should be doing is you should be going into this tab, you should be going in settings, sorting by unemployed, looking where you have a ton of unemployed people, and you should be building stuff there. If you build a bunch of stuff in these places, then they won't be unemployed, and then it won't really matter which welfare law you have. And so, for the most part, I think old age pension is kind of the best one in terms of just looking at it. But if we're thinking about it from the perspective of IG approval rating, poor laws is really good shout because it makes both the industrialists happy, as well as I think it makes we're already on it, but I think it makes the trade unionists a little happy as well, whereas wage subsidies will start pissing off the industrialists. And so I think poor laws is transitionally a very good one, but in like some sort of vacuum, old age pension is going to be better. For migration, so currently, intra-market migration, technically, my understanding, talking to the devs, is it is allowed, but functionally it never happens for discriminated pops. And so there's really not too big a difference between no migration controls and migration controls. An important exception being migration controls will be better if you have a ton of discriminated pops that would leave your country if this law was, or if they were allowed to leave. So if you're playing a country like the EIC maybe, where you don't want your countries to migrate to, your subjects, it can make sense to stay on no migration controls. That way your discriminated pops will not leave, and this can make quite a bit of sense. But for the most part, you're not going to experience much migration unless they're not discriminated, which effectively makes no migration controls functionally very, very, very similar. One important difference is you need no migration controls in order to pop the the new Colossus journal entry, which is going to give you plus 25% migration permanently. This one is very, very strong. You get it when you liberalize kind of everything in your country in terms of you need to be on a parliamentary or a republic of some kind. I believe you need to have either census suffrage or universal suffrage, and you need to pass a bunch of these laws. But what you get is 25% migration attraction for free, which is why I think no migration controls is best. But once you already don't discriminate, once you have, total separation, multiculturalism, which are also required for the new Colossus, then swapping back onto migration controls for the purposes of making some interest groups happier is it's fine. It won't make a big difference for you, or it won't make any difference for you, and so it's more a matter of which IGs you want to support. But closed borders, not good. Migration's a very strong mechanic. This will prevent anyone from migrating. Japan, for example, starts out with it, and this is one of the reasons why they can't get Hokkaido, the very, very strong state, to really kind of pop off, is because they generally have a hard time getting population there into Hokkaido. Very strong state otherwise. Finally, slavery banned. Slavery is just not very good. It depresses SOL. You can't really properly tax the pops. Their consumption profile isn't very good, and so generally you don't like slaves. Now, there is maybe some caveats and maybe a little bit of testing that I would need, where I think staying on slave trade for a little bit of time might be good, especially before you can, really, really get total separation and multiculturalism going. And the event in which I think this may be good is if you are specifically playing a New World country, when you are looking at migration attraction from these New World countries, you will see unused arable land is an absolutely huge modifier for these guys. It's really, really big, and this is a flat modifier. Standard of living is also a flat modifier. One of the downsides of slavery is it generally really depresses standard of living, which will significantly decrease your migration attraction. However, if you already have an absolute banger, flat modifier from unused or arable land, then maybe this isn't so bad, and maybe this can be a good way of getting pops. Overall, I think that the slavery mechanics are pretty weak, and you generally want to ban slavery, but it's not necessarily the highest priority. Also, in particular, slave trade will give landowners a lot of political strength, which is generally seen as a downside. Legacy slavery will keep everyone who is a slave, but you won't import any new slaves. I think if you are going to have slavery, slave trade is going to be best, but this one will also, debt slavery will not empower the landowners. And so this is maybe something to consider, I guess, to some regard, but overall, you're going to enslave most of your discriminated pops. Slaves can't work every job. They can work in the mines, and they can work in the fields, this type of stuff. And so as you start to industrialize, sometimes you get crimped on like what you can really do anyways, because the laborers can only work, I believe it's just in the mines and the fields. So slave trade overall is going to be pretty weak. And to summarize, just kind of go quickly back through it as a little bit of a conclusion. I think rights of assembly is best, mainly because you can go guaranteed libs, and you can still bolster suppress, which you cannot do on protected speech. But going back up the line for outlawed dissent or in that direction, once you have guaranteed libs, is probably fine. I think regulatory bodies is best with a somewhat low degree of confidence following some of the changes in terms of how wages increase, mainly because because workers' protections historically has caused a lot of death spirals. I'm not 100% sure it still causes death spirals, but if it's causing you to have unemployment because the equilibrium, profitability of the building is too low, then I think that this is a bad thing. I'd rather the workers just get paid less and get employed than be unemployed, not producing goods, not adding, value to the country. Because just to kind of explain it a little bit further, there's two ways that value kind of gets added by a building to the country. It gets added by the weekly balance, which gets dividends taxes, it gets reinvested, but also adds in terms of wages. And so if someone can't get hired because the equilibrium profitability is so low, because this hits zero, them getting fired down and not getting the wages, you're losing out on value added to society. So you don't ever want to be having that situation, and I think workers' protections creates that situation. For children's rights, compulsory primary school, literacies, being able to increase your literacy is really, really strong. I guess in theory, maybe you could think about going child labor allowed once you have all the text, but this is like a strangeness. Women's suffrage is going to be better, but it's going to be better when you run out of pops. Before you run out of pops, I think legal guardianship is good, and I think being on legal guardianship with the intention of swapping to women's suffrage is going to be overall an easier gameplay pattern, because it's easier to swap from this to this than one of the other two to women's suffrage. For welfare, I think that old age pension is best, but as a function of just keeping IGs happy, I think you often get on and stay on poor laws, and that this is not a big deal. You're not missing out on much, mainly because you should really, really be aggressively trying to eliminate anyone who's unemployed in your country by specifically going after them in terms of building where they are. They have a very severe malice to birth rate, and so as a result of this, you will get a lot less pops if you allow the unemployed people to marinate in your country. For migration, I think no migration controls is best, mainly because the new Colossus journal entry, but once you are not discriminating against anyone, I think migration controls, it's kind of basically the same thing, specifically for some countries that have a ton of discrimination. To avoid an exodus from your country, I think migration controls could be a decent shout. And finally, we think slavery banned is better, because slaves are just generally not very useful, and you can't tax them, etc., and it will increase SOL, and it prevents the landowners from being empowered. Also, I think that this is going to be required. It unlocks multiple new laws. It's going to be required for multiculturalism, which is very much meta, and so you're going to need to do it eventually if you want to go onto multiculturalism. So that's kind of been the human rights category. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good day. Happy sailing.